I still remember the first time I stayed alone in a cabin deep in the woods. The air was heavy, still, as if the trees themselves were listening. I lit a single lantern, and its pale glow flickered against the walls, leaving long shadows that swayed like they were breathing. Outside, the fog rolled slowly to the forest floor, clinging to every root and stone. There was no wind, no animals moving, not even the usual whisper of leaves. Just silence. A silence so deep it pressed against my ears until I thought I could hear my own pulse. I tried to tell myself it was peaceful, that the world had gone quiet to help me rest. But the longer I stared into that dim orange light, the more I noticed something. The shadows weren't always moving with the flame. Sometimes they moved on their own. I thought I saw a shape just beyond the window, blurred by fog, standing too still to be human. And when I leaned closer, holding my breath to listen, I swear I heard someone whisper my name. That was the first night, the first sign that something was wrong. And if I had known then how far those nights would take me, how deep into the silence I would sink, I never would have unlocked that door. That's when I saw it. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth. Twilight had slipped quietly between the trees, soft and gray. I had found the cabin by chance, tucked deep where the path vanished. The front door was familiar enough, wood swollen with rain, paint flaking like thin, pale skin. I pushed it open. The floor sighed under my weight. That first night, the back door wasn't there, just a single entry, framed by shadows that pressed close. I told myself the mind plays tricks when you're alone, that the wind made patterns in the walls. But the next morning there it was, a second door, opposite the first, dark and unyielding. I hadn't noticed it before, though I retraced every step, every corner of the cabin. It had not been there. Night after night, the back door creaked, always at the same hour. Not a slam, not a bang. A slow, deliberate groan, like the cabin itself breathing. A thin fog would curl from its frame, pale and damp, moving across the floor, touching my ankles, leaving cold trails. I stopped sleeping near it. I would lie awake, counting the minutes, listening to its small movements. The fog whispered along the walls, and the cabin felt different. It had changed while I was watching. One evening, the front window caught the fading light. The glass was wet with condensation, obscuring the trees outside. Through the haze, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the fog's edge. When I blinked, it was gone. The walls seemed to breathe then, not with wind, not with air. I could feel it under my hands when I rested them on the table, in the floorboards that flexed with a faint hum, and the back door. It would always be slightly open, even if I closed it, even if I had watched it minutes before. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. Soft, deliberate, slow. I followed the sound once, creeping along the hallway, but there was nothing, just a fog spilling further into the room. It smelled of wet stone and cold wood. Sometimes the cabin shifted. The table would appear closer to the wall, a chair would angle differently, and the doorway would seem longer, stretching into some impossible depth. I would stop breathing, feeling the air thicken, the walls bending toward me as if listening. I touched the back door once. Cold. I expected a chill like ice, but it was something else. A vibration under my fingers, subtle, like the cabin was alive, like it had been waiting. I tried to leave. Each morning, I packed my bag, told myself I would step out, but by the time my boots hit the threshold, the door at the back would be open, fog spilling over the threshold, and the forest seemed farther than before, darker, empty yet heavy. The nights grew longer. The creaking never stopped. The fog never thinned. I found myself listening to the silence between creaks, waiting for what might emerge. Sometimes, I thought I saw shadows moving behind the front door, stretching and bending as if the cabin itself had arms. I don't try to rationalize it anymore. The back door exists. It shifts, it breathes, it waits, and I stay awake. Every night, counting the slow, deliberate creaks. Every night, watching the fog drift inside, touching the floor, the walls, my hands. I have learned the cabin has patience. It knows I am here, and I am not sure I will ever leave. The floorboards were cold beneath my bare feet. Autumn wind pressed against the window, carrying wet leaves and pine. Evening had fallen, pale and slow, leaving the room dim and quiet. The first night, I noticed it. A faint hum, like breathing, curling from beneath the boards. I paused, hand hovering over the floor, listening to the gentle, shifting whispers that seemed almost deliberate. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling. Old wood, old nails, old dust drifting in the corners. But the next night it was closer, clearer, a thread of voices beneath my toes. They murmured, soft at first, barely there, like the wind rustling in a hollow tree. I couldn't make words, just tones, breath-like, curling and fading, sometimes brushing against my ankles, sometimes pulling at my ribs with cold insistence. By the third evening, one voice became distinct. It whispered my name, slowly, carefully. I froze, heart thumping, palms slick against the floor. I crouched, pressing my ear to the wood. The voice repeated itself, closer, softer, familiar. It carried a weight, an insistence I couldn't ignore. I reached down, fingernails grazing the planks, feeling the hum vibrate through my skin. The smell of damp earth seeped upward, as if the house breathed below. Sleep left me entirely. Every shadow became deeper. Every corner held a pause. I imagined movement under my feet, the whispering rising in static waves, until it became almost a song, an invitation I did not want to answer. I tried to leave the room, but the whispers trailed behind me, clinging to my heels, curling around the walls, pressing into my chest with invisible hands. I spent a day with trembling fingers, tearing at the boards. The edges splintered under my touch. Dust and pale light filled the cracks. I hoped for an empty space, a hollow, a secret tunnel, a hidden chamber. There was nothing, no cavity, just solid earth, unbroken, dense, silent, unyielding. I pressed my ear against the floor. The whispers had stopped, or maybe they were beneath the earth now, quiet, patient, watching. The room smelled of splintered wood and cold stone. I could feel the vibration in my palms, the faint echo of something that had called me. I backed away, chest tight, the boards underfoot now just hardwood, but my skin still tingled with the memory of voices. I spent nights in the corner, listening to the silence between shadows, watching dust motes float like tiny ghosts in the pale light. Every creak of the house became a question, every hum a memory of what had called my name. Curiosity had become regret. I had touched the floor, disturbed it, but I had uncovered nothing. And yet, I could not stop hearing it, the voice that had known my name, the breath beneath my feet, soft, patient, waiting. I do not walk on the boards the same way anymore. I step lightly, careful not to awaken what waits below. And sometimes when the room grows still, I hear it again, just a thread, a curl of sound, and I remember how close it came and how alone I am with the earth beneath my feet. The lantern hung from a hook above the table. Its brass frame was warm from the day's sunlight, but the flame wavered in the dim evening. There was no wind. The air pressed still and heavy against the walls. Yet the lantern guttered, coughing out sparks of light. I reached for it. The glass felt slick and warm, like a pulse under my fingers. When the flame returned, the room seemed different. Shadows shifted along the walls. A chair that had leaned against a corner now faced the center. The rug had wrinkles I had not noticed before. I blinked. Nothing had moved. Yet everything was slightly wrong. I lit it again. The same tremble ran through the flame. Shadows twisted into shapes I did not recognize. The air smelled faintly of smoke and wet stone. I watched the flame, watching the shadows stretch and shrink with each flicker. I set the lantern on the table. Its light seemed fragile, almost hesitant. I leaned closer, feeling the warmth brush my skin, hearing the soft hum of wax and wick. And then it died. The darkness pressed immediately. Thick, heavy, cold. Not the night outside, but something that breathed in the corners, waiting. I reached to relight it. The match sparked. The flame leapt briefly, and the shadows had moved again. I stood in silence. The floorboards cooled beneath my feet. The walls seemed farther away, the ceiling higher than I remembered. The room had changed with every flicker. I could feel in my chest a slow, creeping pressure that did not belong to me. Each time I tried to hold the flame steady, it faltered, a breath across the wick, invisible yet insistent. And each time it died, the shadows rearranged themselves. I saw corners I had never noticed, objects I did not remember. I could smell the faint tang of something metallic, like copper beneath the wood, and the lingering faint smoke of wax. I moved the lantern to the window. Outside, fog clung to the trees, pale and unmoving. I pressed the glass, feeling the chill seep into my palms. The flame wavered, flickered, died. I tried again. The light bloomed for a heartbeat. Shadows crawled along the walls. I could almost hear whispers behind them. Soft steps I had not taken. Breath that was not mine. The lantern would not hold. The last time, it sputtered and fell silent. I stared at it. The wick blackened. The glass gleamed cold and empty. No warmth remained. No movement. Only the quiet hum of my own pulse. I sat near the table, leaning on the edge with my hands pressed to the wood. The room was still but not quiet. Every shadow waited. Every corner watched. The fog outside clung to the window, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and wax. A reminder that something had been here, that something had shifted while I was breathing. I did not move the lantern. I did not relight it. I let it rest, empty and cold. The room held its silence like a shape pressed against my chest, and I could not shake the feeling that had grown around me. I stayed there until sleep crept softly into my bones. The darkness pressed close, not threatening, not cruel, but patient, watching, waiting. And I understood as I drifted that the lantern had left the shadows where they wanted, and I was alone with them and always would be. The night pressed close to the cabin. Fog drifted low among the trees, soft and thick. The air smelled damp, like wet leaves and earth. I was alone, the kind of alone that leans against your back, pressing you into silence. The walls creaked, the floorboard sighed, and then footsteps, heavy, slow, circling the cabin. Not soft, not shy. They pressed against the soil, rustling leaves and bending branches. I froze, heart tightening. The fog moved around them, curling in pale tendrils, hiding the shape that made them. I pressed my palm to the window. Cold glass. I could see nothing beyond the gray. Just fog, breath fogging the pain. The world blurred to silver white. The steps shifted, closer, then farther, then circling again. I could feel the vibration through the floor, through the air, through the thin walls. Every heartbeat matched it. And then a pause. Stillness thick enough to taste. The fog pressed closer. I leaned forward. A pale face appeared, pressed for just a second against the glass. Eyes open, wide, too still to be human, too sudden to be imagined. I jerked back. The cold clung to my skin. Breath caught, shallow, trembling. The face was gone. The fog remained. The footsteps resumed, slower now, deliberate. I listened, air humming faintly through the trees, leaves brushing against each other. The smell of wet wood, dirt, and faint iron. I pressed against the window again, but it was empty. Nothing. Only fog curling and pooling at the edges of the cabin. I did not move. The steps circled once more. Heavy, unrelenting, patient. Each step a pulse in the night. Each pause a question I could not answer. The face had returned in my mind. I could feel its presence pressing through the glass, cold and close, even when it had vanished. I could almost hear its breath, the soft rasp of skin against frost. The fog thickened. I could see only the nearest branches, pale shapes bending and trembling. The world beyond the window became nothing but gray. The footsteps faded slowly, leaving silence that was almost louder than the steps themselves. I stayed by the window for hours, hands pressed to cold glass, listening to hum of the night, watching fog drift like slow smoke. The cabin smelled of damp pine and the faint echo of something unseen. I did not sleep. Every shadow in the room felt like it could move. Every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. The fog pressed closer still, and I could feel the presence in its weight, even after the footsteps had gone. I understood something then. It had been patient, watching, waiting, and I was alone with it, alone in the fog, alone in the silence that followed. The cabin was quiet. Even the wind had softened, leaving only the faint rustle of dry leaves outside. Inside, the air smelled of pine and old wood, a sweetness hiding under the damp. In the corner, the rocking chair waited. I had noticed it earlier, still, empty, almost polite in its silence. But that night it moved, softly at first, a gentle sway, barely disturbing the floor beneath it. I froze. The air grew colder, brushing against my skin like breath. The wood creaked under its own weight, but it felt deliberate, measured. I stepped closer. The chair rocked again, just enough to catch the pale light. Shadows curved along its spindles, stretching long across the floor. I pressed my palm to the armrest. Warm. Or maybe it was a memory of warmth, of someone having sat there before I arrived. The sway grew. Faster. The soft creak became a groan, echoing across the walls. It felt alive. A rhythm, slow and insistent, like a heartbeat. The cabin listened. I listened, and my own heartbeat matched it. The smell of the air shifted. Wood smoke lingering from an earlier fire, mingled with a faint, metallic tang of something unseen. I could feel the floorboards vibrate beneath my feet, a subtle hum that hummed against my chest, pulling at my senses. I stepped back. The chair rocked more violently now, jarring, deliberate, as if someone invisible had settled into it. The sound filled the cabin, echoing long after the chair slowed. Each pause left a silence too thick to breathe through. I watched the shadows twist. They lengthened, flattened, then recoiled as the chair rocked. The room seemed smaller, walls pressing in with each sway. Even the air trembled, holding the memory of movement that wasn't mine. I reached for it again. The chair paused mid-sway, then began again, softer this time. A slow, lonely rhythm. I could almost hear whispers tangled in the creaks, the sigh of a remembering long-forgotten weight. I pressed my ear near the seat. Cold, the faint hum of the cabin beneath my fingertips. A breath, shallow, brushing my skin. The chair stopped suddenly. The silence that followed stretched like fog to the corners of the room. I stayed near for hours. Every movement of the cabin, floorboards settling, wind brushing windows, felt magnified. The chair remained patient, waiting in the corner. And even when it stopped, the sound lingered, echoing in my bones. I finally moved away. The air was heavier, smelling faintly of pine and memory, and the shadows clung to the corners. But I could still hear the echo of the sway, soft and insistent, long after the chair was still. I left the cabin that night, but the rhythm stayed with me, slow, patient, lonely, like a heartbeat pressed beneath the floorboards. The forest was quiet. Thick fog hung low, brushing my legs as I stepped between the trees. The smell of damp earth and pine filled my lungs, heavy and cold. And then, static, a low, crackling hum, like a detuned radio somewhere deep in the trees. I froze. No power lines were near. No wires, no machines. Just trees. I followed it. Soft underbrush pressed against my boots. The static hummed, twisting around the trunks, moving as I moved. Shadows bent and stretched with the fog. I reached out to touch a tree. Cold bark, rough against my fingers. The sound swirled, then vanished. Nothing, only darkness. The fog thickened. It smelled of wet leaves and something faintly metallic. I could feel the hum in my chest. The forest held its breath, and I held mine. I turned back to the cabin. The night was quiet, but inside, the static had followed. Closer now, clearer, curling along the walls and floorboards. I pressed my ear to the table. The hum brushed my skin, vibrating through my palms. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, but the air was still. I walked through the room. The sound shifted with me, curling under my feet, around corners, following me in ways the wind could not. Shadows clung to the walls, long and dark. Every object seemed slightly moved, as if the static carried invisible fingers. I went to the window. Outside, fog wrapped the trees like pale silk. No movement, no source, only the hum, low and insistent, pressing against the glass, against my chest. I could feel in my bones a vibration that was not mine. I pressed my palms to the table, trying to ground myself in the wood, the cool surface, the faint smell of pine and wax. The static pulsed louder now. I stepped backward. Shadows flickered. Floorboards seemed to stretch beneath my feet. The room itself felt wrong, as if it had grown around the sound. I tried to leave the cabin. The static followed, wrapping around my ankles, brushing against my arms. It lingered in corners, hiding in shadows. I could hear in the silence between my steps. I sank into a chair. The hum filled the room, soft, patient, unrelenting. Outside, the forest was silent. Inside, the sound was closer, insisting I notice it, touch it, breathe it in. I did not know how long I sat there. Minutes stretched, fog thickened, shadows pressed closer. The static hummed beneath my skin, a presence I could not see, but could not ignore. Eventually, I stopped moving, stopped breathing heavily, let the vibration pass through me. The hum softened, coiling in the corners, pulling at the edges of the room, waiting. I stayed until dawn. The fog outside thinned. The forest exhaled, but the static remained. Close, quiet, patient. A sound without source. A presence without form. And I understood that it would not leave. It had followed me here, and it would stay, curling in the corners of the cabin, in the shadows between walls, waiting in the silence that now feels heavier than the night. Morning came pale and still. Sunlight pressed softly through the curtains, casting thin, trembling lines across the floor. I noticed it immediately. A coat hung on the wall hook. Dark, heavy, wet. I did not recognize it. It was not mine. It had never been here before. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was clear. The coat dripped slowly onto the wooden floor, pools spreading like shadows stretching. I approached, hand hovering above the fabric. It felt damp, cold, almost alive beneath my fingers. The threads clung to one another, as if they had absorbed something from the night. I could hear the faint drip on the floor, like a slow heartbeat echoing in the empty cabin. I stepped back. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing closer than before. The coat swung slightly, not with the wind, but with its own rhythm, patient and deliberate. Each night it returned, rain dripping, though clouds never gathered. I would wake to the sound, the hum of water falling onto the floor. The smell of wet fabric lingered in the air, mixing with a faint scent of pine and old wood. I tried to touch it, to remove it from the hook, but my fingers brushed only damp air. The coat remained, heavy and waiting, its presence pressed against the edges of the room, cold, patient, silent. I watched shadows stretch along the walls. The hook seemed taller. The coat hung lower, as if the cabin itself had shifted around it. I could feel the wood beneath my feet vibrating. I could smell the faint iron tang in the air, like the coat had absorbed some secret from the night. I stopped sleeping near the hook. I would lie awake, listening to the drip, the slow rhythm of water on wood. Each night, I imagined shapes beneath the fabric, imagined the coat moving in ways it should not. But when I opened my eyes, always hung there, dark, heavy, watching. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was a trick of the mind, but the presence did not fade. It grew thicker with each night, the damp scent pressing into my skin, the slow dripping echoing in the quiet corners. I noticed small changes. The hook seemed to bend slightly under its weight. The coat leaned farther into the room. Its shadow stretched across the floor like smoke. I could hear faint static in the hum of the cabin, a vibration that lingered when all else was still. One night, I reached out again, fingers brushing the damp sleeve. It felt impossibly heavy. A shiver ran up my arm, and then the drip stopped. The coat remained, still and silent. The air smelled of wet wood, but something else lingered, something metallic, a faint tang that set my chest tight. I stepped away. The coat hung there, patient. I could feel its weight in the room, pressing into the corners, curling shadows along the floor. I did not sleep again that night. Morning returned, pale, trembling sunlight across the floorboards. The coat was still there, dripping silently now, its presence a quiet intrusion, I could not remove. I could only watch. And I understood, as I stood frozen in the cabin, that it had no owner. No one had brought it here, yet it belonged. To the room, to the night, to something waiting just beyond the walls. The morning light was pale, brushing thin lines across the floorboards. The air smelled faintly of damp pine and old wood. I had been walking past a window when I noticed it. My reflection smiled. Not me, not what I was doing. It tilted its head slightly, lips curling where mine were still neutral. I stepped back, heart thudding softly against my ribs. The glass fogged with my breath. When I wiped it, the reflection returned, watching, smiling still. I stopped looking at mirrors, at glass. Every pane became a door I did not want to open. The window watched me. Its surface gleamed faintly in the pale light, the edges catching shadows that did not belong. At night, I heard tapping, soft, deliberate, from the glass. The sound pressed against the walls, vibrated under my fingertips when I brushed them along the sill. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, but the air was still. The curtains hung straight. No branches brushed the pane, and the tapping continued, slow, patient, insistent. I avoided the window. I moved to the cabin, feeling shadows stretch and shift with the light. The floorboards hummed faintly underfoot, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like the window had breathed something new into the room. Sometimes I caught glimpses of it from the corner of my eye, a flash of movement, a curve of lips, a tilt of the head. It mirrored me, but not exactly, not in the way I moved, not in the way I felt. And always, that smile lingered. The tapping grew closer. I could feel it through the air, through my chest, through the wooden walls. It seemed to breathe with me, pressing lightly at my shoulder, trailing down my arm in invisible fingers. I dared not look directly. I only glimpsed the window from angles, catching shadows that were too still, too deliberate. The room smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was clear. I could hear the hum of the cabin, soft, vibrating, almost a whisper beneath the tapping. Days passed. The reflection became more persistent. It would not leave when I moved. It followed me across the floorboards, tracing the edges of walls, slipping behind corners where I could not see. Its presence pressed into the room, and I could feel it curling in the silence. I stopped walking near windows. Every pane felt like a door I had closed. But even closed, even avoided, the tapping came. Soft, steady, impossible to ignore. It echoed in the quiet corners, curling in the shadows, pressing against the air itself. I do not know how long I have stayed away from the window. Every light and shadow feels wrong. The cabin hums faintly beneath my hands. The air tastes faintly metallic, and the tapping waits, persistent, patient, and the smile waits, too, always waiting. The night was still. Fog curled around the cabin, pale and slow. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, heavy and damp. It began at 3:12. Every night, like clockwork, a knock at the door. 3 light, deliberate raps. I would hold my breath, listen to the echo pressing against the walls. The hallway smelled faintly with polish and cold air. Floorboards hummed softly under my feet as I approached. I opened the door. Nothing, only the fog curling outside, the faint rustle of leaves, and silence that stretched like smoke. The next night, the same. And the night after, I began to dread the moment. The anticipation curled in my stomach, a slow tightening that followed me through the cabin. Each knock felt heavier than the last, a pulse against the frame, against my chest. One night, I stayed by the door, waiting, listening. The fog outside pressed against the glass, shivering along the edges of the frame. And then the knock, 3 taps, slow, patient. And then a pause, a fourth. This one came from inside. I froze. The air grew colder, brushing against my arms. Shadows stretched along the walls, bending in shapes I did not recognize. The floorboards hummed beneath my feet. The silence pressed, heavy, thick, almost solid. I could smell the faint tang of iron in the air, mixed with the sharp scent of cold wood. The knock came again, closer, deliberate, trailing across the room, circling the walls, curling beneath the furniture. I pressed my hands to the door. It was solid. I could feel the vibration that knocks through the wood, through my palms, pressing into my chest. The cabin itself seemed to lean inward, holding its breath with me. The tapping grew irregular, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, like it was learning the rhythm of my heartbeat. I could hear faint whispers behind the sound, too low to understand, but brushing the edges of my mind. I backed away. The air smelled faintly of damp stone, and shadows clung to corners as if they'd wait. The knocks moved again, pressing into the floorboards, trailing along the walls, pausing when I tried to follow. I crouched near the table, hands pressed to the wood, breath shallow. The room felt alive in a way I could not name. The knock came once more right behind me, and then silence. The fog outside thickened. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and rain, though the air was still. I did not move. The knocking had stopped, but its echo remained, curling the corners, pressing against the walls, waiting. I stayed there until dawn. Shadows retreated with the pale light. The fog thinned. The air warmed. The cabin seemed empty again. But I know it will return. The knock at 3:12. Every night like clockwork. And next time, it will not be at the door. It will come from inside, patient, deliberate, waiting for me to notice. The lantern flickered against the walls. Its pale light stretched across the room, warm and fragile. I noticed a shadow on the opposite wall. Tall, still, not mine. It leaned slightly, reaching higher than the ceiling should allow. I shifted the lantern, moved it closer. The shadow did not change. I pressed my hand to the table. Cold wood, faintly rough beneath my fingertips. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp pine. The shadow remained patient, unmoving. Each night it grew longer. The light pressed against it, but it did not waver. It crept up the wall, spreading into corners, pressing against the edges of the ceiling, stretching across the floor. I could feel in the room, in the air, a weight in the silence. I stepped closer. Floorboards hummed faintly beneath my feet. Shadows in the furniture bent toward it, curving unnaturally in its direction. I pressed my palm to the lantern glass. Warm, but somehow distant. The room smelled faintly metallic, like the shadow had exhaled something unseen. I leaned closer to the wall. The air shivered along my skin. It seemed to ripple with the edges of the shadow, breathing where no air moved. I tried moving the lantern again. Closer, farther, to the side. Still it stayed, fixed, growing with the hours, stretching longer with each passing night. I backed away. The shadow pressed against my vision. Even when I looked elsewhere, I could feel its shape bending the corners of the room. A hum pressed in beneath the floorboards, along the walls, in the silence between each creak. I sat near the table, hands pressed to the wood. The lantern flickered. The shadow swayed slightly, but not with the light. It seemed alive, patient, watching the stillness, spreading, pressing, unrelenting. The air smelled faintly of burnt wax and pine. The floorboards hummed beneath my fingers. I could feel in the shadows of my own body, a quiet pressure along my spine. The shadow did not move, yet I could feel its presence shift, curling at the edges of the ceiling, pressing against the walls, stretching across the floor. I dared not touch the wall, did not move the lantern again. The room held its breath. The shadow held its shape, patient and relentless. Morning came, pale and thin. The lantern's light softened in the daylight. The shadow lingered, faint now but present, its edges stretching just as far as before, waiting for night to return. I do not know how long it will grow. I do not know what it wants. But I know it waits, patient, fixed, a shadow with no source, pressing against the room, pressing against me, relentless. The fireplace was cold. Ashes lay gray and still, smelling faintly of burnt wood and smoke. I knelt to clean it, the bristles of the brush scraping softly against the hearth. Something caught my eye. Small scraps, blackened and curled. I picked them up carefully, feeling the brittle edges against my fingers. The smell of smoke was stronger here, almost clinging to my skin. I unfolded a piece. The handwriting was mine. I had never written this. Words curled across the page in neat lines, addressed to me, warning me. I blinked. A tremble ran down my arms. Another scrap. More letters. Each in my handwriting. Each speaking of things I could not remember. Things I had not yet done. The fire had consumed them, but left enough to whisper their presence. The ash smelled faintly metallic now, like the pages had bled into the air. I stacked the scraps on the table, running my fingers over the brittle edges. Each word pressed against my skin, warm and heavy, though cold to the touch. The room felt smaller, walls leaning closer with the weight of what I could not understand. I tried to dismiss it, told myself the fire had warped old notes, that I had forgotten writing them. But the more I held them, the heavier they felt. A soft hum rose from the hearth, curling into the corners of the room, pressing against the floorboards beneath my feet. The letters seemed to shift as I read them again. Sentences rearranged, words curling into new warnings, new regrets. A faint smell of ink lingered in the air, mixed with the smoke and the damp pine from outside. I felt breath on the back of my neck, though the air was still. I dropped the scrap. It fluttered like a dying moth across the floor. I noticed shadows leaning toward it, stretching long across the walls, pressing along the ceiling, gathering where the light of the hearth could not reach. I knelt again, picking up the letters. The paper was warm now, almost alive beneath my fingers. I traced the lines with my thumb, and a shiver ran through me. The words felt urgent, pleading, pressing into the quiet corners of the cabin. I tried to burn them again. Flame licked the edges, but the letters resisted, curling instead of consuming, pressing the ash into shapes that felt like eyes, watching, waiting. I set them down. The room smelled of wet paper and smoke, and something else, something faintly metallic and familiar, like memory I could not reach. The hum from a hearth persisted, soft, insistent, threading through the walls, pressing into the shadows. I sat back, hands on my knees. The letters lay before me. The ash whispered beneath them. I could feel the weight of every word, every line I had never written. The room grew colder, though the fire was warm. Morning came pale, pressing thin light across the table. The letters remained. Ash clung to their edges, smoke still lingering faintly in the air. I could not tell if the words had grown overnight, or if I had only noticed their presence in the quiet hours. I left the fireplace. The letters stayed. Their words pressed into the room, into the walls, into the air itself. I understood then that some things could not be forgotten, even if I had never remembered writing them. And the ash whispered on. The well sat behind the cabin, dark and still, surrounded by damp earth and moss. The air smelled faintly of water and cold stone, pressing into my lungs as I approached. I picked up a loose stone and dropped it in. The splash echoed softly, a hollow sound stretching down into the black. I watched, listening, and waited. Hours seemed to fold into themselves. The sound returned, splashing, though I had thrown nothing more. A tremble ran through the ground beneath my feet. The air smelled of wet moss and metal, thick with the cold taste of something deep and unseen. I leaned closer to the well. Shadows pulled at its edges. The wind rustled the trees, but the water below was still. I could feel it pressing up, a pull in my chest, a weight in the air, as though the well was breathing beneath me. Each night I came back. The stone, the splash, the endless dark. Sometimes the splashes came without throwing anything. I would hear the water ripple, tiny droplets rising, then the sound of something moving beneath the surface. The air smelled faintly of wet iron and decay. The darkness pressed up into my vision. I tried dropping larger stones. Nothing reached the bottom. The splash returned hours later, slow and deliberate, like the well was counting, keeping time in some rhythm I could not understand. The air trembled faintly, rustling the leaves, pressing against my skin. I stepped back from the edge. The night pressed in. Fog curled along the ground, touching my ankles, brushing the backs of my knees. I could hear the faint hum of water, stretching through the trees, pressing against the cabin walls. Sometimes I spoke, called down into the darkness. Nothing answered, only the splash. Hours later, patient, endless, and a sense of weight pressing upward from the black. The ground felt hollow. The stones felt heavy in my hands, as though the well had already taken them, holding them somewhere deep beneath the earth. I felt vertigo, a slow pull, as if the well wanted me closer. The air smelled damp and metallic. I could taste it on my tongue. Shadows stretched across the ground. The well seemed wider each night, its darkness crawling into the edges of my vision. I could hear the faint drip of water, the hollow hum of something breathing far below. I wanted to stop, but I could not. The pull grew with every visit. The sound of splashing persistent, pressing into my chest, curling into the silence of the cabin. One night, I listened longer. The water moved slowly beneath the surface. Then a splash, closer than before, and a whisper of something brushing against the stone walls. The air was heavy, thick with damp, and I could feel a presence far below, patient, watching, waiting. I stepped back, fog curling around my legs, leaves pressing against my skin. The well remained, endless and black, its sound pressing into my mind, its pull unrelenting. I left for the cabin. The splash echoed in my chest. Hours before the next stone fell, the darkness had weight, the well had depth, and the thing below waited, endless, patient, forever. The morning air was still. Sunlight pressed pale through the thin curtains. The room smelled faintly of linen and damp wood. I noticed the curtains moving, slowly, softly, as if they were inhaling, exhaling, but the air in the cabin was still. I reached out, fingers brushed the fabric. It felt cool, soft, but heavier than it should be. The rustle pressed lightly against my ears, like breath against skin. I pulled the curtain back. Fog pressed gently against the glass, thick and pale, curling along the sill. It wanted inside. I could feel it there, sliding over the floorboards, pressing against the walls. The curtains swayed again, a rhythm, slow and deliberate. In, out, I leaned closer. The fabric seemed alive beneath my fingertips, rising and falling like a faint chest. I could smell something faintly metallic in the air, mixed with a damp scent of fog. It pressed into my nose, coiling along my shoulders. I could feel it brushing my arms, though the air did not move. Each night I watched. The curtains continued their rhythm, pressing against the glass, moving as if the cabin itself breathed. I could hear soft whispers of air, pressing into the corners of the room, curling along the floor. I tried opening the window. The fog hesitated at the edge, then pressed forward, sliding in slowly, touching the edges of the curtains. They swayed faster now, soft and deliberate, but the air remained still inside. I stepped back. The room felt smaller. The cabin hummed faintly beneath the boards, the walls pressing in. The fog curled against the glass, and the curtains continued their soft, living rhythm. It was quiet, but not empty. I dared not touch them again. Each sway pressed against the edge of my mind, a rhythm I could not unhear, a breath I could not ignore. The light fell pale across the floorboards, and shadows stretched along the walls, leaning toward the windows. At night, I would lie awake. The curtains moved, pressing lightly against the glass, pressing against me. The fog hovered at the edges, soft and patient, like something waiting for permission to enter. I began to dread sunrise, for when the light came, I could see the rhythm more clearly. The room breathed, the cabin breathed, and I was caught inside the motion, silent, pressed, alone with the moving fabric and the quiet fog. I pulled the curtains one last time. The fog recoiled slightly, then pressed closer. The fabric swayed with slow determination. The cabin smelled faintly of damp linen and wet earth. I backed away, and the curtains continued to breathe. The journal lay on the table, blank and still. The pages smelled faintly of paper and old ink, soft under my fingers as I touched the cover. I didn't remember leaving it there. I opened it slowly. Blank pages stared back, white and expectant. The room smelled faintly of wood polish and dust, and the pale light from the window stretched long shadows across the floor. That night, I checked again. Words had appeared. My handwriting. Neat, familiar, but I did not remember writing them. Sentences describing things I had not done, events that would unfold tomorrow. I ran my fingers over the ink. It was warm, almost alive, pressing into the paper. The room smelled faintly of smoke and wet earth. I could hear faint creaks beneath the floorboards, like the cabin itself was listening. The next morning, The words came true, exactly as the journal had said. A chill pressed along my spine. The cabin seemed smaller, tighter. Shadows bent toward the corners where the journal lay, stretching long in the pale light. I tried to leave it alone, closed it tightly, pressed my hand to the cover. But each night, the pages filled themselves again. Lines describing hours that had not yet come, thoughts I had not yet had, moments I could not escape. I smelled faintly of ink and damp paper. The pages whispered beneath my fingers. Each letter pressed like a finger tracing my skin, each sentence curling into the quiet corners of the room. The hum of the floorboards grew faintly louder, a rhythm syncing with my own heartbeat. I tried to ignore it. The journal waited, patient. The words poured across the pages overnight, pressing into the paper, as if they had always belonged there. But not to me. I began reading the entries carefully. Each line unfolded events I had not yet lived, mistakes I had not yet made, choices I had not yet taken. The cabin smelled faintly of wet wood and smoke, and shadows clung closer with each sentence. I wrote nothing, yet my hand seemed to tremble over the empty pages, as though it recognized the words already pressed into existence. The journal was patient, persistent, and the words came true, every single one. The cabin grew quieter at night. The air thickened with the smell of damp ink and wood. Shadows pressed along the walls, leaning toward the journal, waiting with me. I realized then I could not escape the entries. They arrived whether I wanted them or not, and each morning the world followed the ink lines. I began to dread the blank pages, knowing they would fill themselves and I would live their contents. Helpless to stop what was written, I closed the journal, pressed my hands to the cover. The words hummed beneath my palms, soft, insistent, inevitable. The room smelled faintly of paper and wet earth. The shadows retreated slightly with the pale light, but only for a moment. Night would come again, and with it, the journal would write itself. The entries would wait for me. I would read them and live them. The pages whispered. The night settled thick around the cabin. Fog clung to the trees, soft and heavy, pressing its cold breath into the corners of the yard. The air smelled of wet pine and earth, damp with decay. At first, it was faint, a low hum drifting through the walls, vibrating softly along the floorboards. I felt in my chest, a subtle pulse beneath my ribs, like the forest itself had begun to breathe. I stepped outside. Fog curled around my ankles. The hum pressed closer, threads of sound wrapping around the trees, touching the bark, curling into the roots. It smelled metallic now, like distant rain over old iron. At first, it was almost soothing, a lullaby carried on the wind. I pressed my hand to a tree, felt the vibrations ripple up my arm. The forest was alive, and I was small, just a part of its quiet rhythm. But it grew. The hum thickened, pressing against the cabin walls, shaking the glass of the windows. A faint rattle ran along the shelves. The vibration hummed through my teeth, pressed along my skull, and the calm turned heavy, almost unbearable. I listened. Branches shivered in the fog, the sound curling along the ground. The hum stretched longer, deeper, pressing into the corners of the room. The smell of wet wood and damp leaves filled the air, clinging to my hair, my skin. I tried to step back. The floorboards hummed beneath my feet, pressing up through the soles of my shoes. The hum grew louder, sharper, echoing through the cabin like some vast, invisible machinery. Glasses on the shelves rattled, tipped slightly on their rims, tiny tremors like distant footsteps through the fog. I pressed my hands to my ears. It was impossible to block. The sound pressed into my chest, into my lungs, curling around my rib cage. I could feel the forest vibrating in my bones, patient, persistent, relentless. I sat on the floor. The hum rolled beneath me, thick and suffocating. Shadows leaned along the walls, stretching toward the windows, pressing along the floorboards. The fog outside pressed against the cabin, moving gently as if alive. Hours passed. The hum pulsed like some slow heartbeat, pressing the air, pressing my mind. I could taste it, metallic and thick, in the back of my throat. The vibration lingered in the wood, through the floor, the ceiling, the walls, wrapping the cabin in its quiet, unrelenting song. Morning came pale and hesitant. The hum softened, retreating into the fog and trees. But it had left a weight behind, a vibration that lingered in the floorboards, in my chest, in the hollow spaces of the cabin. I knew it would return. After midnight, when the forest woke, its hum would rise again, soft at first, then pressing, until it filled every corner, and I would be caught once more in the resonance of the night. The forest hummed, and I could do nothing but listen. Morning light pressed pale across the cabin floor. I moved through the hallway, the smell of damp wood and pine pressing softly into my nose. The cabin felt familiar, comfortable, safe, but something was different. A hallway I did not remember, leading to a door I had not built. The wood was pale, edges smooth, as if it had always been there, and yet I knew it was new. I touched the doorknob. Cold, unyielding. The air pressed closer around me, a soft threading through the floorboards. Fog curled along the edges, pushing lightly at my ankles. I opened the door. Nothing but fog inside. Soft, pale, curling like smoke. I stepped in, the mist pressing around my legs, touching my skin like wet silk. The air smelled faintly metallic, damp and ancient. A faint sound reached me. Laughter. Soft, almost playful. It threaded through the fog, pressing against the walls, curling along the ceiling. I could not see its source. Could not tell if it belonged to the cabin or something else. The fog shifted. It pressed into the corners, moving gently with a life of its own. Shadows bent along the edges of the doorway, leaning in toward the hall. The hum of the floorboards beneath my feet grew faintly louder, synchronized with the soft laughter. I tried to step back. The doorframe seemed to stretch, the edges bending into the mist. I could feel the fog curling around my ankles, pressing at my knees, pulling at me, inviting me further. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and smoke. I shivered. The laughter softened, then stopped, leaving the cabin quiet, too quiet. The fog lingered, soft and patient, pressing against the walls, watching. I closed the door. The hallway felt smaller, edges sharper. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and mist. The extra room had not vanished. I knew it would be there tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after. I dared not open it again. Yet I could not forget it. The fog, the laughter, the quiet pull. It lingered in my mind, pressing into my chest, coiling along my spine. Night came. I lay in bed, the cabin breathing softly around me, but I could hear the faint hum of the extra room, waiting, patient, inviting me back. The door would be there tomorrow, and the fog inside would wait. Fog rolled across the yard as night fell. It pressed into the trees, soft and cold against my skin. The cabin smelled of damp wood and pine, a faint hint of smoke lingering in the corners. Through the haze, I saw it, a pale figure, motionless, its presence pressed into the fog. So still I almost convinced myself it was a trick of the shadows. Night after night it returned, standing beyond the yard, beyond the reach of light, waiting, patient, silent. I could feel its gaze pressing through the fog, curling around my chest. I dared not step outside. The fog curled around my ankles, cold and damp. I could hear soft rustling, branches brushing against each other, as if whispering in the wind. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and cold stone. I watched from the window. The figure never moved closer during the night. But each morning, the fog carried something else. Footprints. Shallow impressions across the floorboards, leading from the edge of the cabin, moving toward the door I had not opened, then stopping. I pressed my hands to the glass. The air outside smelled faintly metallic, like rain over iron. The fog moved gently against the pane, as though it were breathing, pushing the figure closer, pressing it toward me. Some mornings it was gone, the yard empty, no trace of footprints outside. But inside, the impressions remained. Soft, wet, and fleeting, leading across the floor, curling around the corners of the cabin. I began to dread the fog. It carried more than cold air now. It carried presence. Wait, a patience I could not escape. The pale visitor pressed against the world, and I felt it reaching toward me through every shadow. I stayed near the window at night, fog curling around my ankles, hands pressed to the cold glass. The figure waited beyond the haze, silent, pale, patient. And I could hear its presence inside the cabin. Soft footprints tracing the floors, curling along the edges of the walls, pressing closer with every night. I do not know what it wants, only that it comes, and that when the fog swallows the yard, it will be closer than I can bear. The pale visitor waits, always waiting. I lay in bed, the room heavy with night air, damp and faintly metallic. The cabin smelled of pine and cold wood, the faint hum of the wind threading through the boards. Above me, a soft scratch. I froze. Fingers pressed lightly into the ceiling. Pale, thin, pressing, as if reaching down for me. The sound grew, scratching, tapping, dragging along the boards. Each movement deliberate, a rhythm I could not name. The air smelled of dust and old paint, pressing into my lungs, sharp and cold. I pressed my hand to the mattress, feeling its vibration beneath me. The scratches moved again, closer, deliberate, as though the ceiling itself were alive. I could hear soft creaks along the floorboards, echoing the movement above. I tried to breathe slowly. The hands did not stop. Fingers pressed against the wood, softly at first, then harder, leaving shadows along the ceiling where they lingered. The smell of damp would deepen, like the air itself had thickened with intent. I wanted to move. My body would not respond. The hands traced slowly along the boards, pressing down toward me. A coldness reached my skin, even without touching me. I could feel their weight, leaning, pressing, patient. The room grew smaller. Shadows leaned from the corners, stretching along the walls toward the bed. Each tap pressed into my chest, my shoulders, my mind, curling through my thoughts, soft and deliberate. I closed my eyes. The scratches continued, fingers moving as if alive, pressing patterns into the wood I could not see. The cabin smelled faintly of wet pine, mixed with a heavy scent of something older, something patient. I dared not look again, but I could feel them, hands stretching to the ceiling, searching, probing, pressing down in the quiet. The air trembled slightly, like the ceiling itself breathed slowly above me. Hours passed. The scratching faded, but the weight remained, curling my chest, pressing along my spine. I knew it would return. Every night, the hands would come back, patient, insistent, touching, pressing, above the bed where I could not escape. The ceiling is not empty. It never was. I found it under the bed. Old wood, dark and heavy, edges worn smooth from years of touch. The smell of dust must pressed into my nose. I didn't remember putting it there. The lock was rusted, stubborn. I tried turning it. It would not budge. The air smelled faintly metallic, and the floorboards hummed softly beneath my feet. That night I heard it, a soft rattle, from beneath the bed, slow, deliberate, as though something inside was moving, pressing against the wood, trying to get out. I knelt, pressed my hand to the trunk. Cold, solid, unyielding. The rattling continued, soft at first, then harder, echoing faintly through the floorboards, curling along the walls of the cabin. The air smelled damp, like wet earth and old paper. I lay in bed. The trunk rattled. The sound pressed into the room, soft vibrations curling into my chest. I could feel it in my ribs, in my spine, like the cabin itself was moving with it. Each morning, I checked. The trunk was still there, the lock unchanged. Empty, yet not empty. I could feel something inside, patient, waiting. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust. Nights passed. The rattling grew louder, more deliberate. It pressed against the floor, against the walls, against the air around me. I did not sleep. I could not. One morning, I found it open, the lid wide, empty, no trace of what had moved inside. The air smelled faintly of damp wood, but the absence left a weight, a hollow quiet, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. The trunk had released nothing, yet everything felt different. The floorboards hummed faintly beneath my feet. The shadows lingered longer in the corners. I could still feel it pressing, patient and unseen. I closed the lid gently. The cabin felt smaller. Air thick with the smell of dust and damp. The trunk waited, patient, insistent, and I knew it would rattle again. Every night. I could hear it. Soft vibrations beneath the floorboards, pressing against the walls, curling around the edges of my mind. The trunk waits. Always waits. The attic smelled of old wood and dust. The faint tang of mildew pressed into my nose. I climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The pale light from the small window stretched long shadows across the rafters. There it was, a mirror, tall, narrow, its frame dark and warped, edges curling like smoke. The glass shimmered faintly, but it did not reflect me. I leaned closer. The cabin behind me appeared in the glass, but no trace of my own reflection. Instead, sometimes another figure lingered behind the walls of the glass. Just a shadow at first, then something pale, still watching. I stepped back. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and cold iron. The attic floorboards groaned beneath my weight. Shadows clung to the corners, pressing along the edges of the walls. The mirror seemed alive, waiting. At night, I heard in my dreams a soft hum, the mirror calling from above. I could see the cabin inside the glass, but my reflection never returned. Only the figure, pale, patient, watching, waiting. I tried covering it. Blankets, boxes, anything. The mirror pressed through the room, regardless. The air smelled faintly metallic, thick with the weight of unseen presence. Sometimes I thought I heard faint footsteps behind me, but the attic remained empty. I touched the glass lightly. Cold. The figure shifted, mirrored my movement before I made it. A soft pressure pressed through glass, curling into my hand, into my wrist. The shadows in the room leaned closer. Morning came pale. The mirror stood as if it had always been there. The figure was gone, yet I could still feel it pressing along the edges of the attic, along the walls of the cabin. I do not look at mirrors anymore. Not in the attic, not in the cabin. Sometime in a window or a darkened glass, I catch a glimpse, just a shadow behind reflection. Always there, always patient. The mirror waits, and I know it will always be watching. Night pressed against the cabin, fog curling along the edges of the walls, soft and damp against the skin. The air smelled of wet pine, metallic and heavy, pressing into my lungs. It started softly, a voice, mine or almost mine, coming from the fog outside. Low, distant, coaxing, threading through the silence like smoke. I pressed my ear to the window. The air was still, no movement, yet the voice called my name. Gentle at first, almost reassuring, and I could feel it pressing along my chest. Night after night it returned, growing clearer, more insistent. The fog outside seemed to lean closer, pressing against the cabin, wrapping around the walls and floorboards. I stepped outside once. The forest was empty. The mist clung to trees, cold and damp. No one was there. But the voice called again, from just beyond the edge of sight, soft and persuasive, curling into the fog in my mind. I tried to ignore it, stayed inside, pressed my hands to my ears. The voice grew desperate, pleading, coaxing, almost human. It mimicked my own tone, my own patterns of speech, twisting familiarity into unease. It called me closer, step by step, into the fog that pressed at the cabin, into the unknown beyond the yard. I could feel the damp chill coiling around my ankles, around my chest, wrapping into my thoughts. I stayed awake all night, listening. The voice whispered, sometimes patient, sometimes urgent, never leaving, threading to the floorboards, pressing along the walls. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain over iron. Morning brought no relief. The fog lingered. The voice was quiet, but it had left its weight behind, curling in my chest, pressing against my mind. I knew it would return at night, patient, convincing, desperate, and I knew I could not trust it. It sounded like me. It knew my name. It would pull me outside, and I might follow, because it is my voice, or almost mine, calling me from fog. Night settled thick over the cabin. The air smelled of damp wood and cold pine, pressing softly against my skin. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, soft, uneven, alive in the quiet. The chair was there, wooden, plain, unremarkable, yet somehow closer than before. I did not move it, but it had edged forward, pressing toward the bed, patient, silent. I froze. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain over iron. I could feel the chair's presence, its weight pressing along the floor, softly, deliberately. Night after night, it inched closer, little by little, a rhythm too subtle to notice until the bed frame shifted against it. I lay awake, listening, hearing faint scratches as the legs traced the floorboards, soft footsteps that were not mine. I touched the bedpost. The wood trembled slightly beneath my fingers. The chair was closer still. Cold air pressed into the room, smelling faintly of damp earth, curling around my ankles, touching my skin in the darkness. I dare not move. I could feel the chair pressing against the edge of the mattress, leaning in, patient, insistent, silent. The shadows clung to the corners of the room, stretching along the walls, mirroring the chair's slow advance. Some nights I woke to find it even nearer, pressed against the bed frame. No sign of force, no explanation. The air smelled faintly of old wood and cold sweat, pressing into my lungs, curling into my chest. I stopped reaching for it, stopped trying to move it back. It was no longer just a chair. It was a presence, watching, waiting, pressing closer each night. I lie awake, the floorboards humming faintly beneath me, my breath shallow, feeling it beside the bed, patient, quiet, unyielding, and I know it will always move closer, always press against the bed frame, until the night itself feels crowded, until I cannot breathe without touching its shadow. Morning light filtered pale through the fog. The cabin smelled of damp wood and old paper. I noticed them first at the edge of my vision, small, dark shapes against the wall. Photographs, nailed in place. Each one showed me asleep. The blankets twisted around me, the lights soft and quiet, and in the background, always, the pale figure, closer than before. I stepped closer. The smell of damp pine and dust pressed into my nose. The photographs were old, yellowed at the edges, but the images were current, caught only hours ago, though I could not remember anyone taking them. I touched one, cold paper, smooth, yet pressing against my fingers like it belonged. The air grew heavier, faint static threading to the walls, curling into my chest. I could hear the soft hum of the cabin, the faint creak of floorboards as if someone walked behind me. Night came. I counted the photographs again. The figure had moved closer, each one a step forward. Shadows pressed into the corners of the room, leaning along the walls, stretching toward images. I tried to remove them, tore them from the wall. The nails stayed. The images lingered in my mind, trailing behind my eyes, pressing into quiet corners of the cabin. I avoided sleep. Even brief closes of my eyes brought glimpses. The pale figure, patient closer, curling along the edges of every shadow. The air smelled faintly metallic, damp like rain pressing through fog. Morning revealed nothing new. The photographs had not returned, yet the weight remained, pressing along the walls, curling around the corners of my mind. I knew the figure was patient. It would wait. It would come closer, every night, inch by inch, and I would see it always just behind the lens, always just out of reach. The photographs are not mine, and yet they always know me. Morning fog clung to the cabin, thick and damp, curling around the walls. The air smelled of wet pine and cold earth, pressing gently against my skin. I wandered the hall, and then I saw it, a door, taller than any before, edges warped, dark as shadow. I did not remember it being built. It leaned slightly in the hallway, as though waiting for me. I touched the handle. Cold, it pressed into my hand like iron. The wood hummed faintly, vibrating through my fingers, pressing along the hallway, curling around the floorboards. I opened it. The air was thick with fog, smelling faintly of damp stone and rain. A hallway stretched ahead, endless doors curling into the darkness, each one a shape, a shadow, pressing at the edge of my vision. Step by step, I moved inside. The fog pressed against my ankles, cold and soft, alive in its weight. Each door hummed faintly, a low vibration I could feel through the soles of my feet. I wanted to turn back, but I could not. The doors stretched onward, Endless. Impossible. Each one whispered with unseen voices, pressing at the edges of my mind, curling into my thoughts. The hallway pulsed faintly, alive in the quiet. I reached for a door. It opened inward, and the darkness inside pressed against me, soft and infinite. I stepped inside. The fog swallowed me. The hallway did not end. I felt the pull, patient, unyielding, pressing along my chest, curling into my bones. Each door hummed soft, insistent, like breath I could not escape. I turned back. The hallway stretched, endless, and the last door closed behind me. But the pull remained. The cabin, the walls, even the floor beneath my feet seemed to fold inward, pulling me deeper towards something infinite. I am inside now. The doors stretch ahead, each one waiting. And I feel it. The pull is patient, relentless, and I am already part of the endless hallway. I stepped outside. The fog pressed into my skin, thick, cold, curling around my ankles. The forest was gone. The cabin was gone. Only silence remained. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain over iron. No birds. No wind. No soft hum of insects. Only the quiet, complete, pressing into my chest, into my ears, into my mind. I walked slowly. The ground was soft beneath my feet, like moss pressed over stone. Every step seemed to echo inside me, yet there was no one to hear. The fog drifted around me, curling against my legs, brushing along my arms, as if alive. I called out once. My voice was swallowed immediately, vanishing into the emptiness. The silence listened, patient, infinite. It pressed against my lungs, stirred the hairs along my arms, and I realized I had never been alone. No footprints marked the fog behind me. No shape moved in the endless gray, but the stillness was alive. It breathed, slow, deliberate, curling around me, pressing closer. I tried to turn back. The cabin, the path, the world I knew, all gone. Only fog and silence. The quiet thickened, folding around me, and I understood that it had always been here. I took a step forward. The fog clung, pressing against me, and the silence followed. Every step I took carried me deeper into nothing. There was no fear, only the stillness, patient, eternal. And I felt it then, not alone, never alone, even when the world had vanished. The fog moved with me. The silence moved with me. I was part of it now, and it was part of me. I walked, and the quiet pressed, alive and infinite, until there was nothing else to walk to and nothing else to hear.